Support for Franklin Mc Cain flashbacks and observations from a civil rights pioneer is made possible by a generous grant from the Arts and Science Council of Charlotte-Mecklenburg. ASC, Culture for All.
I think that I was just centered on a particular thought, and I think that I was free to let it come in.
Franklin Mc Cain's vision of equality galvanized thousands.
And when the gentleman sat out in Greensboro, we all knew, yes, here's the handle.
That handle inspired college students and pushed a prominent activist on a path of social justice.
Black people, people of color, could not come into a store like a Woolworth, take a seat at a lunch counter, and get something to eat.
This kind of rebellion against racism has attracted admirers for decades.
They're pioneers to us, and as pioneers, they showed us that it was possible for us not only to get an education, but to stand up for justice.
Prisoner Clarence Henry Graham. Offense, trespassing, disposition, guilty. Sentence, $100 or 30 days. Conditions, sent to chain gang.
I didn't know at the time that this was such a courageous feat.
Courage acknowledged at the opening of Greensboro Civil Rights Museum.
Franklin Mc Cain changed history.
History changed through opening new doors and honoring the tenets of nonviolence.
The message went out loud and clear. We don't want violence and we don't want ugly things in Greensboro, North Carolina, because it is bad for business.
Groundbreaking risks carried out by student protesters demonstrated the possible, and these efforts over time would bring a series of rewards, both seen and unseen. Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Crump. Well-defined tributes acknowledge the bold stand taken by 4 teenage freshmen at North Carolina A&T some 60 years ago. Their names are etched across the campus landscape: McCain, McNeil, Richmond, and Blair, all better known as the Greensboro Four. Over the years, Franklin Mc Cain has been credited as being the student ringleader, and his decisive action put him and others on the right side of history. As recognition comes from the changes ushered in by mainly black college students who fought racism in the 1960s, we offer the insights as well as some of the reflections through Franklin Mc Cain, flashbacks and observations from a civil rights trailblazer.
Business activity during the day has been reported off by some store managers, at or near normal by others.
America's military forces entered World War II, the very same year Franklin Eugene McCain was born in Union County, North Carolina during 1941. 18 years later, when Fidel Castro ascended to power in Cuba during 1959, McCain enrolled at Greensboro's North Carolina A&T University. On this campus, he was in search of a new kind of power that altered history and changed our country.
I could have expended all that energy, all that pain, for something else.
His pain, deeply rooted in principle and conviction, because on February 1st, 1960, Franklin Mc Cain, along with David Richmond, Joseph McNeil, and Ezell Blair, caused the soil to shake by being among those successfully ushering in the nation's sit-in movement.
It doesn't take a lot of people to do whatever it is that people thought was impossible.
Taking on long-shot odds rocked this downtown Woolworths and fueled a volatile climate, hurling emotions to the brink. This challenge meant fighting the wrath brought on by Decades of Jim Crow rule that were often humiliating, blatant, and downright heinous.
It's the supreme of absurdity, really. It's so absurd. I mean, you can't even think that way. You can't. It's just so illogical.
Bold and collective acts of bravery carried out less than 100 years after slavery by these student protesters stood squarely on the shoulders of the heroic efforts of the Tuskegee Airmen, the athleticism of Jackie Robinson, and the stirring impact of Rosa Parks, who was a catalyst behind the Montgomery bus boycotts, to name just a few.
That black people, people of color, could not come into a store like a Woolworth, take a seat at a lunch counter, and get something to eat.
The burdensome task, according to Georgia Congressman John Lewis, who sat in at 5 and dime stores across Nashville just days after Greensboro, ended up in a Tennessee jail. Aggressive actions with the intent of altering America's strict rules of traditional custom and social engagement.
But it could not get a soft drink and a hamburger or a hot dog or a milkshake at the same lunch counter with a white person. That is unreal. That is hard to believe.
Commonly referred to as the student architect on the A&T campus, Franklin Mc Cain admits his emotions went from fear to exhilaration when it came to taking a seat at the Woolworths.
On February 1st, 1960, after I sat in for about 5 minutes, you're absolutely right, I was invincible. And I guess probably more important than invincible, I had a sense of dignity, a sense of worth, and a sense of manhood, and to an extent that I had never felt in my life before. In fact, it was just overwhelming. And I had the real feeling that if life should have ended at that very moment, then I wouldn't have been cheated at all. I would have had it all in terms of what life has to offer. I mean, that's how good I felt.
Exuberance from sitting in could be short-lived because bringing change required daily perseverance needed for the long journey.
For any movement to be successful, and first of all, to carry out movements, it is darn hard work. You have to have vision, you have to have commitment, and you have to have something that very few people have. That's faith.
The walk-through by the hundreds and then thousands of young Negroes has made an impression, but their call for a general boycott has been unheard or unheeded by the many Negroes in Greensboro.
What Franklin Mc Cain and the A&T students kicked off created an unforeseen domino effect.
I can tell you in all honesty, it does not feel just like yesterday.
Dr. Esther Terry was among those who took a seat at the Woolworths. She graduated from Greensboro's all-women's Bennett College, and decades later became the school's president.
We were on a mission that the Bennett girls who were there with me had a sense of determination. We knew that we were doing something important.
I think that Franklin Mc Cain and the folks at A&T tapped into the power of HBCUs, the historically black colleges that are thick on the ground in North Carolina, from NC Central to A&T, Bennett College, Johnson C. Smith University.
I don't think we got to the point where we were thinking that, well, when we do this, it's going to be High Point, North Carolina tomorrow, and Danville, Virginia the next day, and Fayetteville the next day, and Winston-Salem the next day. I don't think we thought that way at all.
Telling headlines magnified the response from city to city, and the highly charged and deeply emotional demonstrations even landed Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in an Atlanta jail cell.
And they were demonstrating that Black Lives Matter by the stand that they took. And they were forcing not only America to come to terms with that, they were forcing the world to come to terms with it.
Charlotte is one place in the Carolinas where history became redefined. Students 90 miles away from A&T at Johnson C. Smith University jumped into the fray.
We are as equal to all of God's children because we are God's children. And to take that concept and place it in the public arena so that everybody had to process, ooh, this is some powerful stuff.
Charles Jones helped lead the effort from JCSU.
The when and where was clear. The what was clear. We just were able to give the why because not too many people talking. But underneath the whole generation of black students at that point was this need to attack this system of nonsense called segregation.
We didn't want to include the administration.
B.B. Delane rallied the Smith students, filled a bus outside of Biddle Hall, and drove them to the store so their quest could begin at the counters. Some of those on the front lines were enrolled in JCSU's seminary.
A lot of that influence of the seminary, spilled over into how we conducted things.
Hundreds of college students around the nation found themselves locked up and facing jail time during the demonstrations.
They didn't have far to take us. They drug us out the back, right to the jailhouse.
Jail was behind here.
Yeah.
Weeks of incarceration was the steep price paid by protesters from South Carolina's now closed Friendship College. Nearly 60 years later, rebellious students from the once historically black place of learning are celebrated as the Friendship Nine. In 1961, they were abruptly hauled away by Rock Hill police from the downtown McCrory's.
We spent a month together in a place that we really didn't want to be.
1 month at the York County Prison Camp. That's where they spent time on a chain gang, combined with days and nights in solitary confinement. It was a stiff penalty for sitting at these counters of conflict. Defiantly bucking long-standing separate and unequal traditions birthed the concept of going to jail and not anteing up the money for bail.
It was kind of excitement along with fear. I think some of us were more scared than others.
Sure I was.
Yeah.
I'm not afraid. I'm not ashamed to admit it.
Docket number 414, prisoner Willie Thomas Massey. Offense, trespassing. Disposition, guilty, $100 or 30 days.
Life's later years allowed these South Carolina survivors to see their convictions overturned.
There is only one reason these men were arrested. There's only one reason that they were charged and convicted for trespassing, and that is because they were black.
People go into jail simply because they want to exercise equal rights or just want to sit down and have a cup of coffee. How ridiculous can you be?
Back in Charlotte, fighting against an unequal seating system meant being innovative. And in the case of Johnson C. Smith University, light-skinned African Americans like Thomas Wright and Betty Houchins Lundy were sent to Ivy's department store, where workers in the restaurant couldn't tell the difference.
We just walked right in, and nothing was said. He was so busy, watching for people of color, And we went in and sat down, and the waitress was very congenial, and she kept coming to us, or is everything all right? Just as you would now, when you go in a restaurant. And underneath the table, my legs were trembling, because I didn't know at what point somebody was going to come to us and say, leave, So we sat there for about an hour eating, I think it was chicken sandwiches. And, we were just chatting with each other, what's going to happen next, So we sat there for about an hour and a half. And after that, we went out and joined the picket line. And, wow, you should have seen the expression on the, the people that served us and the other whites that were in there, you know, they couldn't believe what had just happened.
We were doing the same kinds of things. In fact, we were even a little bit more devilish. On a couple of occasions, we had some people to wrap themselves up in turbans and robes and go in and ask for service. Some people who looked just like me, except they had a turban and a robe on, and asked for service. And without hesitation at all, they were served immediately, no problem whatsoever. In fact, the last person who did that took his turban off and took his robe off right at the counter after he finished eating and sat down and asked for more service and was promptly denied.
Strongly intoxicated with the goals of integration, inclusion, and full citizenship became the burning desire of these students, and pursuing such a lofty ideal meant enduring abject and downright dangerous hardships.
So to spit on me and call me names, it didn't bother me. I learned, though, that people who do that are insecure and feel threatened.
High tension and drama were among the ongoing challenges of remaining nonviolent in Greensboro. City fathers helped to keep the peace.
As you go through the South, I think there's a pattern. The communities where the white leadership somehow figured out how to welcome this change as slowly as they did have done better than the communities where people violently opposed the change.
And we didn't have a kind of violence that you saw in Montgomery and Birmingham or some other cities, is because the city fathers in Greensboro were not necessarily concerned with my rights or me achieving my rights. They didn't want their precious town to have a blemish or a bad name.
Where do we go from here? Leaders wrestled with that question.
Sustained energy connected to the student protests in North Carolina's third largest city lasted for 6 months. That's how long it took before the Greensboro Woolworths opened its lunch counters to all. During 1960, what students in Greensboro and elsewhere achieved could be called a moral victory. But time has given Franklin Mc Cain a very different view of the world.
You know, there's an adage that says everything changes but remains the same. And while we have made significant number of changes, there are some things that have not changed.
This man's thirst for fairness did not begin and end at the Greensboro Woolworths. The 60s battle for equal rights expanded his sense of cultural awareness and humanity. McCain's curiosity led him to be with the multitude of thousands on hand for what's been described as America's watershed moment, the 1963 March on Washington.
People understood what the objectives were, and they believed in them, and they wanted to believe even more. They wanted to be told that, yes, you are doing right, and you're on the right track. And that's what Washington was all about.
However, in the 21st century, McCain flashes back to civil rights exercises of the 1960s and says, today's youth views past struggles as far-fetched stories.
You really know how to make them up, yes. Because people don't treat people that way. People don't do that. People just don't do that. And you know, on one hand, that's gratifying. On the other hand, it's somewhat disappointing.
The International Civil Rights Center and Museum in Greensboro, North Carolina is now open.
Greensboro's Civil Rights Museum was eventually birthed out of the lunch counter struggle. It opened during the 50th anniversary of the sit-in demonstrations on February 1st, 2010.
And that museum says equally significant, or significantly, that you need to take inventory, Franklin, and you need to make an assessment, because perhaps you haven't done all that you could have or you should have.
We need places to be able to come and grieve, and also not just grieve, but to articulate what our hopes are for something better.
That's a key part of what the South has given not just us, but the entire United States.
That museum is my conscience.
4 years after this festive 50th anniversary, we would lose a civil rights pioneer at age 73.
This new America that we're now celebrating, where all Americans can vote and all Americans in the share, we can eat what we choose and go to schools where we choose. All this comes through the portals of led by Franklin Mc Cain.
It wasn't just civil rights leaders among the mourners, but also individuals who fought on the front lines of change, including retired Army General Joseph McNeil. He was among the Greensboro Four on February 1.
Others may have done it, but we were just happy to have done our part. We were team players, and came out all right.
I certainly was not afraid, and I was thinking about the options that I had given myself for that day that I thought might be present. And one was, if I were extremely lucky, I would go to jail for a long, long time.
In his life, Franklin Mc Cain made it a point not to focus on personal accomplishments, but rather remain committed on what could be called unfinished business.
The work that lies ahead, I think, is for people to begin to practice real citizenship. What I think we've got today is a country and a community full of people who practice citizenship in a casual fashion. And you can even see it in our voting patterns or how people don't vote.
Some apparently want to continue the present silent marches. Others feel more active efforts, sit-ins, jailings may provide impetus. Some are for no action at all for the moment.
During the protest of 1960, African American shoppers did not turn their backs on downtown Greensboro businesses. They remained loyal despite the obvious conflict at Woolworth's. However, historians who measure time and the impact of critical events feel Greensboro represents an important moment in an ongoing story regarding change.
When the sit-in started in Greensboro on February the 1st, 1960, that brought joy and happiness to many of us. There were people saying, by sitting down, they're standing up for the best of America.
I think without the work of Frank and those other students that joined him, you don't get a Barack Obama. You don't get a voting rights. You don't get Thurgood Marshall appointed to the Supreme Court. All of the kinds of things that help the progressive forward movement that happened in this country through blood, sweat, and tears of the 60s, that door was pried open by Franklin Mc Cain.
Individuals who lived through that experience and took a leap of faith years later cherish long-standing virtues and point to this global leader who provided lasting inspiration.
Gandhi, who had taken the simple notion of soul force, satyagraha, the capacity of the human spirit to assume total responsibility for making social change, but doing it by simply putting his body and spirit in the machinery.
And in the case of Franklin Eugene McCain, offering personal sacrifice required that he give something back.
You know the expression, what have you done for me lately? Don't tell me about yesterday. That's what I get credit for. I mean, I've got a mortgage and I've got rent to pay for being on this earth. And that is a debt that I absolutely never finish paying.
In many respects, Franklin Mc Cain's life represents a different kind of revolving debt that continues to make a difference some 60 years later. Despite his contributions of moving our society forward, he was also a father, grandfather, community leader, as well as a respected businessman. His life offers both a meaningful and solid legacy and demonstrating positive change across 2 centuries that offers the potential and possibility of how people working together can improve the human condition. That's Franklin Mc Cain, Flashbacks and Observations from a Civil Rights Trailblazer. I'm Steve Crump. Thanks so much for joining us.